Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and today we're taking a look at an extraordinarily rare Finnish sniper rifle. This is, the first mass production Finnish Army sniper rifle. It is the M27PH, PH for Physica, which is the name of the company that developed the scope. It is also sometimes called an M37 rifle because it was actually adopted in 1937, but more typically referred to as a 27PH because it is a Model 27 base rifle with a Physica scope. So let's start at the beginning of the story here for Finnish sniper rifles, and that would be, of course, when Finland gets its independence at the end of World War I. The Finnish military and the Finnish Civil Guard both inherited basically all of their small arms from the Russians when they kicked the Russians out of the country. Well, the Russian Imperial Army in World War I did not have sniper rifles, and thus the Finnish Army did not inherit any sniper rifles. In the 1920s, both the Army and the Finnish Civil Guard took an interest in sniping rifles and started investigating them. The Army did some testing on scopes. They tested 8 different models or brands of scopes. They came up with 2 that they liked, the Goetz, and Zeiss, both out of Germany. However, they were on the cusp of introducing a new rifle, the M27, which is this base rifle, and they opted to hold off on any further work on snipers until they had the new rifle in hand. Otherwise, they would have been doing work on old Russian M91s. The Finnish Civil Guard at that time was at the tail end of using Japanese Arisakas as their standard arm, and in the late 1920s, the Finnish Civil Guard was actually experimenting with putting scopes on Arisakas. Didn't end up really working out for them. The Arisakas were approaching end of life, and in the late 1920s, the Civil Guard got rid of all its Arisakas. What they ended up doing was taking one of their M28 rifles, again, the new pattern of Finnish modified improved version of the Mosin Nagant. They took one of their M28s and sent it to Germany to have it outfitted by someone. The records don't tell us who anymore, it's been lost, but outfitted as a sniper rifle with a German Zeiss scope. It comes back in 1929. They like it. They're using a side rail mount fairly similar to the Russian side rail, which was also developed basically by the Germans. They end up ordering 10 more rifles and assemble a total of 11 of these M28 rifles with a variety of different brands of scopes on them. Now, the Civil Guard will then improve its own rifle. It goes from the M28 to the M2830 a few years later, and once they have the 2830 in hand and in production, they decide to make a batch of snipers of those as well. They buy 25 Zeiss scopes, fit those out on rifles. That brings the Civil Guard to a grand inventory total of 36 scoped snipers rifles. That's not a whole lot in comparison to the 50,000 plus that the Red Army, the Soviet Army, had when Russia invaded at the beginning of the Winter War. Now, once they got these M2830 snipers, which confusingly was designated the M33 sniper rifle, once they got those, they kind of held off on any further work because within a short time, the Finnish Army was getting back to its development of sniper rifles, and the Civil Guard wanted to see what the Army would ultimately develop. So we go back to the Army side of things. They now have their M27 rifle, and they already had a couple of good scopes approved for use that they knew were high quality, but they decide not to use any of those. Instead, they decide that they want to develop a multi-purpose optic, something that can be used on both bolt-action sniping rifles, the Mosins, as well as Maxim guns. They want to be able to put this on machine guns as well, and I believe also 20mm cannons. The idea being, hey, and this is one of those classic good idea fairy procurement project things of, wouldn't it make a lot more sense to have one scope for a wide variety of applications? That way, every scoped weapon has the same parts. We only have to train the armorers on one thing. If we have a problem with one, we can swap out a scope. Like, the squad has a problem with its Maxim gun scope. The sniper can take his scope off and they can put it on the Maxim gun. That kind of thing. In reality, as so often happens, what they adopted was a truly terrible scope that was good for none of the intended roles, and that was the Physica scope here. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at this and how they mounted it, and then we'll talk about what ultimately happened with these rifles. If you like Finnish sniper rifles, and you're this deep into this video, so you almost certainly do, you should definitely check out my brand new book, Forged in Snow, Finnish Small Arms, 1917 through 2025. It covers not just the whole arc of Finnish Mosin-Nagant sniper rifle development, all the way through the TK-IV-85, but also Finnish small arms from pistols to anti-tank rifles. All sorts of cool stuff. It is currently in pre-sale on Kickstarter. We have an awesome campaign with lots of stretch goals and accessories and add-ons and cool different pledge levels and exclusive offers. So check it out. Link is in the description text below. There are a number of unusual features about the Physica scope. First off, it is prismatic. So you look in down here and you are seeing out up there. There are a couple of prisms inside the scope. It is also offset from the side of the rifle by a fairly significant margin. Now, on the later M39 PH snipers that use this same scope, they actually mounted a big wooden cheek piece on the side of the rifle to help you offset your cheek weld to see through the scope. On the earlier M27 PHs, there was no such modification made. Some of these were refurbished during the continuation war to add a cheek piece like that, but the standard original design was the way this one is set up. When it was first adopted into service, the M27 used essentially a standard Mosin-Nagant bolt that was just heated and bent down very slightly, so that when it cycles, that bend gives it just a little bit of clearance against the scope base here, enough that you can actually operate the rifle, although it's not great. Now, once the Winter War starts, the M27 is the primary Finnish sniper rifle that's available during the war, and as they start to get combat experience with it, people start to realize that there are some real shortcomings to several elements of, well, there's shortcomings to everything about this rifle, but they're able to fix a couple of them really on the fly. So two wartime modifications that were made. One was the replacement of bolts with a Soviet sniper style bolt, which is much longer and much more bent and gives a lot better leverage. Now you've got your hand out here well away from the scope. If you're wearing gloves or anything like that, much easier to use this than the original little stubby bolt handle. Similarly, they realized that getting a cheek rest or a cheek weld on this offset scope was really pretty awkward, and so they decided to develop a wooden cheek piece here that they could simply splice into existing stocks. So if you look at it from the back, you can see this is just a solid piece of wood. They've cut a slot out in the stock, comes out to right there, slid this in, and then fixed it in place, and that gives the shooter a nice solid rest that lines up with the offset optic. Why they didn't do something like the US did with the M1 Garand and just use a leather cheek pad that straps onto the side of the rifle, I don't know. That seems like that would have been a much simpler solution. The mount is also an interesting one in that there is no physical locking piece. There is just a wedge here on the side of the scope. Note that there are actually two. So there's a wedge here which is used to mount this on the rifle. For the theoretical eventual machine gun mount, it would have used this dovetail bracket on the bottom. But for rifle use, they just went ahead and welded this base plate onto the side of the receiver. You can see it's a reasonably crude weld. It's just, kind of get it in there, make it work. And it has a tapered dovetail in it. And the idea is when you shoot, the inertia of the scope is going to want it to stay in place while the rifle recoils backward. And so it does, in fact, tighten itself with every shot. All right, I pulled the stock off so you can see the underside. This is actually cleaned up nicely, the welding underneath there. But yeah, they just welded that plate onto the side. Doesn't really interfere with any of the rest of the rifle. You can see they did number it, and they did also number the scopes. This one has been renumbered at some point in its life, and today its scope is not matching. Scope is 164. This is a 3-power scope, so 3x magnification. It has a 24 millimeter, or just about 1 inch lens on it. Zeroable, of course. It is heavy. That's one of the other characteristics here. It weighs in at 800 grams, which is 1 3/4 pounds. It is a very chunky, dense scope. It has a very short eye relief of about 40 millimeters, or about 1.5 inches. They never did equip it with a rubber eye cup, which would have been a good idea, so that you could press your eye nice and close up into that scope. Instead, you just had to kind of hold your eye at the right place, and recoil would, often as not, clonk into your face. We also have access here to one of the original scope cases for the PH scope. So, well, cloth lined, actually not a bad case. So when you're not using it, you transport it, you store it and transport it in this case, because despite their bulk, these are actually relatively fragile scopes. So that's the scope, and then there's a slot in the side for the scope removal tool, which is a pretty fancy concept for what is just a metal stick. Like I said, when installing the scope, you don't actually have to like hammer it in or anything, because the recoil from firing will actually set this tighter with every shot made. Inertia, laws of physics are such that when you fire, the rifle is going to want to go backward. The scope will tend to stay in place, and so it gets essentially hammered tighter and tighter with every shot, which does leave you with a bit of a dilemma on how to remove it. One option is to hit the front of it with a hammer. That's not a great idea because, again, these are relatively fragile, and so instead they have a hole right there, and that's where you take your fancy scope removal tool. You just drop it into that hole and lever it backwards, and it does actually a really good job of breaking this loose without an actual impact that might damage it. So these removal tools are virtually always missing, and as a result, virtually every PH scope that survives today has a whole bunch of hammer marks in the front, like this one does, from people just using a hammer to remove them. I'm sure it's not coincidental, but most of them also have cracked glass. They didn't do anything fundamentally different to the triggers, but this particular one at least has a very nice trigger in it. Really short, crisp, single stage trigger press. So that's at least good. The scope itself is not so good. So we talked about the short eye relief, the weight, the awkward, clumsy side mounting. I didn't mention the fact that this had a number of problems in field service. They tended to fog in the cold. When humidity changed, when temperature changed, you could easily get fog inside of these. They were also fragile. A lot of shooting could jar the prisms inside and render the scope inoperable. So it kind of did nothing good at all. It does, however, have an interesting reticle in it. Let me see if I can get a good camera angle there. All right, this is a little bit tricky to get, but there's the reticle. So you can see there are little human silhouettes in there that are to show you the size of a target from 300 out to 800 meters. We have some ranging stadia for wind and elevation holds, and then a center pointer and a pair of horizontal lines. So not a terrible reticle for its time, although pretty much everything else about the scope was, in fact, terrible. For what it's worth, the rifles that were used for these M27s, we don't have a specific list of serial numbers. Most of them were apparently above 80,000. This one is just barely below 80,000. They all had Tikka barrels, and they're M27 rifles. And they were developed and produced late enough that they have a number of the improvements to the M27, notably the popsicle stick nose cap strengthening up here at the front. The screws on this one are really tight down, so I don't want to mess around with trying to loosen them, but the way the adjustments on this would work, for windage, you've got the knob here on the side. For elevation, you've got the knob on the top, and you actually have a locking screw. So not, don't think clickable turrets like we have today. The idea here is you loosen this up, and then you can adjust this for the amount of elevation that you need, or the amount of windage you need, and then you tighten the locking screw back up, and it works until such time as recoil or environmental conditions or whatever loosen that guy up, and then it moves on you, and you have to fix it when hopefully you realize that it happens before you miss a critical shot. In December of 1937, the Finnish Army finished their trials of this rifle setup and decided to adopt it, despite its significant number of flaws. Hence the formal designation of M37 rifle, adopted in December of 1937. They went ahead and ordered 250 of the Physica scopes. The plan was to build 150 sniper rifles and put the other 100 scopes on Maxim machine guns. That never actually happened. When the Winter War broke out, they only had 84 of the scopes in hand in military inventory. Production of these took way longer than was anticipated, and it wasn't actually until June of 1940 that those 150 sniper rifles were actually assembled. Now, if you know the chronology of the Winter War, you may be thinking the war was over before June, and you would be right. The war was indeed over before June. So these rifles would actually see service after the Winter War and in the early years of, or the early period of the Continuation War. What ended up happening is the rifles went into service, nobody liked them, everybody was much happier with captured Russian snipers, PEs and PEMs. These guns get used. Ultimately, the 100 scopes that are set aside for machine guns are never mounted on machine guns. They are instead used to make M39 PH snipers. So the Finnish Army and Civil Guard collaborated on a universal service rifle right at the cusp of the Winter War. That was the M39 rifle. That's a rifle that really didn't go into production and use until, again, the Continuation War. And in order, they basically just copy-pasted this mounting system and scope onto the M39. So as M27 PH rifles were worn out in service, their parts were generally cannibalized to make more M39 PHs. Ultimately by 1951, which is this year when the Finnish military did a whole inventory of the weapons that it still had, there were a whopping 24 of these rifles left in Finnish inventory out of the original 150 manufactured. So this was a rare rifle to begin with. Most of them are destroyed or cannibalized during the Continuation War, leaving just a tiny number at the end. These were basically all sold off as surplus in the 70s and 80s. Most of them, the vast majority of them that survive, are in Finnish collections, museum and private, but there are one or two here in the United States, like this one. So a very big thanks to the anonymous viewer who gave me permission to borrow this one to film it for you. It's an extraordinarily rare rifle and a very cool look at basically at procurement gone wrong. And also a good example of how just because something is rare does not mean it is good, because this is, in practice, frankly, a pretty terrible sniper. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.